Hi, everyone. Welcome to the San Francisco Chronicle's live coverage of Election Day. I'm Audrey Cooper, the editor-in-chief of the San Francisco Chronicle, and I'm joined by my colleague, opinion page editor, John Diaz. Happy Election Day, John. You voted already?
I voted, and I hope most of you viewers have voted. If you haven't, and you haven't done your homework, it is not too late to pick up today's San Francisco Chronicle or online at sfchronicle.com, where we have our election guide.
Yeah, it's really great.
Everything you need to know.
Right. It has both John's team's endorsements for the race, but it also has the coverage of the races and the issues behind them from the Chronicle's newsroom. We'll be talking to you live throughout the night. We have a number of guests that we've scheduled to come in and join us. Among them, we'll have Willie Brown. I saw Willie, as you probably did, just a few minutes ago at the Election Day party that is held every election day at John's Grill. He told me he's already been through 3 wardrobe changes so far today. So we'll see what Willie's wearing and get his thoughts. We also have Mayor Farrell coming. And who else are we going to see tonight?
Well, we have Christine Pelosi, the daughter of the House Minority Leader, who hopes to be the Speaker. Of course, the first question we'll be asking Christine is, have you talked to your mom? What does she think? Mm-hmm. We also have James Taylor, not the acoustic guitarist, but rather the USF professor who's really follows particularly a lot of the national elections. He'll have some interesting things. He's tentatively scheduled to be here at 10 o'clock, so at that point tonight, we should have some results to sort through.
Right. This will be just like the CNN election night broadcast without the holograms and the fancy touch screens behind us, but hopefully more content and more context for everybody to make sense of this election night. The truth is, after tonight, we may not have a lot of answers about who won in some of these races.
Well, particularly in San Francisco. The mayor's race obviously has been very competitive, and with ranked choice voting, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to in the last few days asking what do you think is going to happen, and I've yet to have anybody give me a definitive prediction, which is true. So unusual in politics, because that's even true with the campaigns.
Right, absolutely.
They don't know.
So you have some things that you said you were looking for tonight. Do you want to run down the John Diaz top things to watch this election night? What are they?
Here are the things, not necessarily in this order, but we're certainly, number one, we're going to be looking at those 7 congressional races in California that are traditionally Republican, but that Hillary Clinton carried in 2016. The Democrats really think that those races are the key to being able to take back the House of Representatives, to pick up at least a few of those seats. But the Democrats have a little problem, Audrey, namely too much democracy. In a number of those races, there are so many Democratic candidates that with the top 2 primary, just a primer for voters who are tuning in not familiar with the system, in California we now go under a system in which the top 2 vote getters advance to general election regardless of party. So in some of those races, there may be 2 Republicans in the November runoff, which will totally dissipate the Democrats' chances.
Right. So what else besides those 7 races are you looking for?
Well, the governor's race obviously is a marquee event in any year. And this year, it's certainly, at least if the polls are to be believed, Gavin Newsom has a pretty formidable first place lead. Polls show him somewhere in the 30% range, others well behind him. I don't think there's any doubt that Gavin Newsom is going to make the November election. The big question is who will be that number 2? Will it be Antonio Villaraigosa, former mayor of Los Angeles? Will we have a north-south Giants-Dodgers type rivalry? Or will it be John Cox, Republican businessman who's self-funded a lot of his campaign? And if it is John Cox, that will also have implications for those congressional races.
Right. And Gavin Newsom has been accused by some of his own party of being so dominant in this race that he might actually discourage Democrats from coming out and voting in those key congressional races. Is that a fair critique to make?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things going on. Audrey, you're certainly right. His dominance is deterring some Democrats from going. But the other factor that's kind of interesting, Gavin has made no secret of the fact that he wants John Cox to be his opponent and have an easy general election.
Sure.
And because there's no doubt with the Republican registration, as you had on page 1 the other day, now at less than 25% in California, behind decline to state, or no party preference, or independent, whatever you want to call it. Right now, if it is a traditional Republican-Democratic race, there's no question that Gavin Newsom will win big. However, there are also a number of surveys out there, particularly that the business community has done, that showed that if there's no Republican at the top of the ticket, that will really deter Republican votes and thus could help Democrats in some of those competitive races. So we have this interesting situation where Gavin's strategy, where he's clearly trying to promote John Cox, none too subtly, reminding Republican-based voters that John Cox is their guy, that could actually have the indirect effect of helping the Republicans keep the House and thus helping Donald Trump stay in the White House.
Well, and this is what I find so fascinating about this is this seems to be a problem that Gavin has with his own party frequently. When he was mayor and he started marrying gay couples well ahead of the Supreme Court decision that allowed gay couples the right to get married, he was accused of really rallying the evangelical base and making a decision and making an impact in the presidential race too. So it's familiar ground maybe for Gavin to be in.
And that's one that Gavin and his spin doctors love to counter. But I think if you look at the facts, that was in February 2004 when same-sex couples were allowed to marry at City Hall in defiance of not only federal law but state law then. But in a number of the swing states, measures went on the ballot to prohibit same-sex marriage. That presumably brought out more evangelicals, as you mentioned, and probably contributed to George W. Bush's victory. Whether it made the difference or not over John Kerry, you can argue, but no question it was a plus for George W. Bush, who won a relatively close election.
Right, absolutely. The last thing before we move on to the other races, I have to ask you, what do you think happened to Villaraigosa? We had him in for an editorial board interview. He started with a pro-Giants statement, which I thought was trying to win over the home crowd. It was very smart of him. What happened to his campaign? It really seemed to lose steam.
If it even had a lot of steam to begin with, Audrey, it's really remarkable. Considering that he was mayor of Los Angeles, a much larger city than San Francisco, had been assembly speaker before that, so he certainly had a big profile. He's a charismatic guy. He is really good on the stump, but from the beginning, his campaign has really had very little traction, and it wasn't for lack of trying, because as we saw when he came in for an editorial board, I thought Antonio Villaraigosa, in terms of calibrating his message to our editorial board, was one of the more impressive performances that I've seen in quite a long time. He talked about his positions and how those were in sync with our editorial board. Really,
he did his homework.
He did his homework as well as any candidate I've seen in a while.
But you didn't endorse him.
We did not.
He stayed with the home team.
Well, it wasn't entirely a home team. If you read our editorial, which is on that voter guide, I think the thing that Gavin Newsom has done so effectively is he has a big picture vision on different issues, and I think that translates, especially in this particular political environment. I think that wears a little better than.
Then policy wonkiness.
Yeah,
like he has
the wonkiness of Villaraigosa, and I can get deals, I can work with people. I think voters kind of go, yeah, blah, blah, blah.
But what do you stand for? So the most excitement in at least the city of San Francisco right now is the mayor's race. We have 4 primary candidates and a lot of secondary candidates. Supervisor Jane Kim. We have London Breed, the president of the Board of Supervisors, and for a brief period of time after the death of Mayor Ed Lee, interim mayor, We have Mark Leno, a longtime legislator in this area, that has really well-known name recognition in San Francisco, although he doesn't currently hold elective office. And Angela Alioto, who comes from a long political family in San Francisco, certainly has her own experience in government. But ranked choice voting, that's the name of the game. Explain to us what in the heck is ranked choice voting, why do we do it, and how does it work?
Audrey, I thought you were about to explain ranked choice voting. I thought, well, what a public service you're about to commit. You know, and by the way, there's one other name we have to mention, because I was at that John's Grill gathering of political types, and at one point I was cornered by Amy Farrell Weiss.
Ah, yes.
who was giving me an earful about the mainstream media and how we shut her out. So Amy Farrell Weiss is also on today's ballot. To your question, which I wasn't dodging.
I know.
On
You would never
ranked
dodge
choice
a question.
Ranked choice voting basically gives the voters a chance to vote for three candidates: their first choice, their second choice, their third choice. And basically the way it works is after the first round of voting, unless one of the candidates gets 50 plus 1% of the vote, whoever is at the bottom, and then there are 8 candidates total, their vote goes away, and then their second choice comes into play. And so this continues round after round until one of the candidates ends up with 50 plus 1% of the vote. Now, the interesting thing about ranked choice that we've seen over recent years is you can't necessarily tell by who has the most first place votes where they're going to end up. Most famously in Oakland, Don Parada was up ahead of Jean Quan, 36% to 24%. She ended up, as the candidates were taken off and their votes were then replaced or reapportioned, she ended up winning that election. And quite a surprise. I think everyone was stunned at that. So who knows how this thing is going to go when the balls
everything's
stop
sorted
bouncing.
out. The thing that I keep hearing from the political watchers is if London Breed, which I think many people think in the first round she'll probably be ahead of the vote, but if she's ahead by 5, 7, 10%, that is a substantial difference. If it's only less than 5%, then we have a real race. And Mark Leno and Jane Kim have made it pretty apparent that they're running almost as a slate. They've said that they want people to rank them number 1 and number 2. I've heard some criticism on our own comments on sfchronicle.com that this was a backroom deal by politicians. It was anything but a backroom deal. It's front and center. It is a well-advertised strategy. When I went to vote this morning, there are rules about how close campaigners can get to the polling stations. But because of how the politics work in San Francisco, the Democratic Central Committee, which is largely run by the more left politicians in this town, they were handing out Mark and Jane paraphernalia. They tried to give my son the Mark Leno stickers to put all over him, which he was mad when his mom wouldn't let him take.
Come on. He's not a working journalist yet.
You don't want your
Audrey.
kid. The journalists don't want their kids going to school covered in Mark Leno stickers, as nice as the stickers may be. But it seems to me that it's going to come down to if you assume that Angela Alioto and Amy Farrell Weiss are probably on the lower end of everybody's votes, what their secondary picks are is going to make a big difference in this race. And then, I don't want to handicap this, but it seems like it's not out of the picture at all that Mark and Jane's strategy will put one of them in room 200 at the end of the day, even if the majority of voters didn't want it to turn out that way. And even if we had a runoff, it might have turned out for London.
That is certainly the conventional wisdom right now, is that whoever comes in second in the first round is going to be in a pretty good position. Then again, the conventional wisdom is often wrong, as we know, as being in the business that listens to the people with the conventional, wisdom.
That is definitely true. But I think whatever happens in this race will really tell us a lot about San Francisco and its politics moving forward. I think a lot of political consultants are kind of maybe not confused by ranked choice voting, but the strategy doesn't seem very clear. After this race, it seems to me people will have a much better idea of where to go after. And one of those neighborhoods are the West Side neighborhoods. typically a little more conservative. We're hearing a lot of words that so far up to 2/3 of the votes that have already been cast are older voters. So if the Jane Kim and Mark Leno, if they can't get the younger voters, the Bernie-crats, the people that were really in for Bernie, if they don't come out to vote today, it might make a huge difference.
And the interesting thing that we've seen in recent years, Audrey, is that in a citywide election, even though San Francisco has this very liberal reputation, very progressive board of supervisors, citywide elections, it still tends to be the centrist candidate tends to prevail. Now, there could be a change this year. We'll see. But you look at like Willie Brown versus his opponents, Gavin Newsom when he was running against Tom Ammiano or Matt Gonzalez, Ed Lee certainly, Frank Jordan before then. I mean, you have to really go back to Art Agnos before we've really had, the
and he was only a one-term mayor.
Exactly, defeated by Mayor Frank Jordan.
All right, so let's move out of San Francisco. Judges. We have a lot of judges that are on the ballot and a lot of controversy behind that. Your editorial in endorsing our incumbent judges that are running was basically saying this is not the appropriate way to rule the judiciary. It should be a separate function. Why is this a race?
Well, it's a race because 4 public defenders, by their own admission, got together for drinks and said, we need to take out some of these judges and send a message. And then they basically divvied up, you face him, you face her, and selected 4 judges who, not coincidentally, while they are Democrats themselves, were appointed by Republicans. And it's really become very much a political campaign as opposed to going after the judges on their record or their judicial philosophy, or none of the challengers that came in really made a case that I am more qualified to be judged, than the other. So it's really been interesting that not just the judiciary has rallied around the incumbents, but a lot of people in the legal community who otherwise would be considered progressive and active in civil rights have endorsed the incumbents on the feeling that judicial independence is really what this is about. We've seen this elsewhere in the country, in Texas and elsewhere, where conservatives have gone after judges they consider too liberal. Not that they disagree with their rulings in terms of being fidelity with the law, but just that they want to take these judges out. And our philosophy, or at least what we said editorially, is if it's wrong there, it's wrong here.
And we have one other judge race that we're watching in Santa Clara County. This one has really lit up social media, and that's Judge Persky, who some people think gave Brock Turner, the Stanford swimmer who was convicted of sexually assaulting a woman who was not in a position to consent to sexual relations. He gave him a sentence of 6 months. A lot of people thought that was outrageous. We're in a Me Too era where people are really becoming aware of the epidemic of assault and harassment, and it was too much for some of the people in Santa Clara County. Does Judge Persky have a chance of retaining his seat in the face of all that?
If I had to bet, I would say that he will be recalled, which would make him the first judge in California to be recalled in 86 years. Obviously this case was such a disheartening case in so many ways. Just a despicable situation. But the question is not whether the judge followed the law or not, but whether the law really took into account everything. And a lot of people within the judiciary and in the legal community have said, if you look at the facts of this case, even though it became obviously high profile because it was a Stanford swimmer and because of the Me Too movement, that his ruling wasn't all that necessary. His sentencing was not necessarily all that out of line with what you would see in other cases. But boy, it's hard to defend. I would not want to be Judge Persky in this election. And I have to say, especially I think the opponents of Judge Persky have done a very good, aggressive campaign of getting their message out. I think that is going to be one to watch because it is no small deal to have a judge recalled in California.
Right. And this idea of getting more politics into our criminal justice system is also affecting the the Alameda County District Attorney race right now too, which is really interesting. You know, I don't think many of us would have thought that Nancy O'Malley, the current DA, would have been an obvious candidate for a challenge, but she's being attacked very heavily from the left, from a candidate who says, of Pamela Price, who says she's not going to prosecute misdemeanors to a point where she's told us that includes DUIs and also some forms of domestic violence, misdemeanor forms of domestic violence, but she's pretty consistent about that. She's gotten a lot of support in the last couple of days. Lorraine Powell Jobs, the widow of Steve Jobs, just came out with a major campaign donation for her. The Black Lives Matter campaign, which has a huge base in Oakland, seems to be going for her. Is this a real race or is this just noise?
This is certainly Nancy O'Malley's biggest challenge, and she really hasn't been challenged to any degree in more than 2 decades. A couple things that are going on that are interesting here. Her opponent, Pamela Price, is received a huge infusion of funds from George Soros, who's actually been funding progressive social justice DAs around the state. As you noted, Nancy O'Malley is kind of a curious target. If you look at some of the mailers, you would think that Pamela Price's mailers, you would think that she was running against Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio.
Yeah.
Whereas Nancy O'Malley, in many ways, has been progressive, particularly on areas like human trafficking and sexual assault. But I think there's no question that this is a race. The race is there with that amount of money. Pamela Price, who knows what will happen if she is elected? You mentioned, what she said about not prosecuting certain misdemeanors. There are a number of eye-rolling things in our editorial board meeting where, at one point, she was asked point blank by me. She was talking about changing the color, the dynamic of the color of people who are being sent to prison. And she said, I asked her point blank, would you take somebody's race into account in deciding whether to prosecute? And she goes, certainly, just like that, without hesitating, which I think raises some constitutional questions.
Absolutely.
The other thing that's kind of interesting is when Pamela Price was in, she said that Nancy O'Malley, the incumbent, has 75 death penalty cases in the works. And I found that really curious, given that up until now, Nancy O'Malley had only brought the death penalty in one case in her long tenure in Alameda County. And I asked Pamela Price if she was sure of that and whether she could document it. And she said, yes, I have the budget for the public defender's office. Well, it turns out the next day she emails me and said I misspoke. And actually those 75 cases were homicide cases. Oh. Not a single one was the death penalty. So who knows what kind of district attorney she would be, but I would not count her out. That's a very competitive race.
But this is a national strategy. A lot of the Bernie-crats, after Bernie didn't get the Democratic nod in the presidential primary, they said, our problem is not the presidential election. We need to go local. If we want real systemic change in the criminal justice system, we need to go after the DAs who overcharge cases and the over-prosecution of people and bring some more justice. So it's interesting that it's come writ large in Alameda County, a blue area of a blue state, but this is something that we've seen nationwide.
Yeah, absolutely, Audrey. And in looking at the results in Alameda County may or may not be the telltale on whether this strategy is paying off. I think if we look at all these cases, I think, certainly the whole idea of criminal justice reform, looking at sentencing, the over-imprisonment of people on relatively minor crimes, definitely a legitimate issue. It'll be interesting to see how it plays elsewhere.
Yeah. So we are going to be back with you live in a few hours, perhaps. We'll come back at around 5 o'clock and talk about some races more in depth, perhaps a few hours before the polls close. And then once the polls close, we have 2 mayors coming on, Christine Pelosi, some political experts. So we're going to be here all night. The newsroom behind us will start getting full any minute now. And you can follow us live on sfchronicle.com. We're also doing something new this year, which I'm very excited about. We're going to have a live election night broadcast. Our political reporters have literally generations of experience calling these races. And if you could hear John Wildermuth on election night talking about precincts that are turning out and why they're important and why they're not, my idea is just to take the sponge that is John Wildermuth's knowledge and wring it out on that blog. So hopefully you'll see a lot of interesting insights there on sfchronicle.com. So John, thank you, and I'll see you in a few hours.
Thank you, Audrey. This is the place to be. A reminder to vote and a reminder to check out if you haven't voted, to check out our election guide. We make it easy for you.
Yeah, I took it to the polls. I didn't agree with you on everything, but I did take it to the polls. It's a great handy guide.
Maybe after the polls close, we can get into that.
Yeah, maybe. All right. Thanks, everyone.